The Community Jigsaw Puzzle. A cozy sleep story about quiet connection. There is something about a library in winter that feels like coming home. Perhaps it is the contrast between the cold that presses against the windows and the warmth that wraps around you the moment you step through the doors. Or perhaps it is simply the particular quality of light that exists only in these spaces, the kind that seems to come not just from the overhead fixtures, but from the books themselves, from all those thousands of stories quietly waiting on their shelves. It was the first week of December when I first noticed the puzzle. I had come to the library that Monday evening, as I often did, seeking refuge from the early darkness and the bite of winter wind. The vestibule, that transitional space between the bitter outside world and the hushed sanctuary of the reading rooms, had always been one of my favorite spots. It was neither quite inside nor quite out, a threshold place with its own particular character. The library had positioned a few comfortable chairs there, along with a small bulletin board announcing community events and a rack of local newspapers. Most people passed through quickly, eager to reach the warmth of the main room, but I had always appreciated this in-between space, this pause before entering. That evening, something new had appeared. A card table, the kind with folding legs that had seen better days, stood against the wall beneath the bulletin board. Someone had draped it with a simple white cloth, the edges hanging down almost to the floor. On top of the cloth, spread in magnificent chaos, were what must have been thousands of jigsaw puzzle pieces. They covered almost the entire surface of the table, a bewildering sea of shapes and colors, and next to them sat the lid of a puzzle box showing the image they would eventually form. It was a Victorian winter village scene, the kind you might find on a Christmas card, all snowy rooftops and glowing windows, church steeples and cobblestone streets, frosted trees and lamplit pathways. In one corner, someone had placed a small handwritten sign on an index card, propped against the puzzle box lid. The handwriting was careful and unhurried, the kind formed by someone who still remembered cursive from their school days. It read simply, "Care to help?" I stood there for a long moment, my coat still buttoned, my scarf still wrapped around my neck, and studied the scene before me. The puzzle pieces caught the light from the overhead fixture, and I could see that someone had already begun the work. A small section of border had been assembled in one corner, perhaps 20 or 30 pieces connected, forming part of the puzzle's edge. The rest waited in their beautiful, overwhelming disorder. It was 5,000 pieces, according to the box. 5,000 tiny fragments of a picture, each one necessary, each one unique, each one waiting to find its place in the larger whole. I did not touch the puzzle that first evening. I simply looked at it, absorbing its presence, its invitation, its quiet promise of something being built piece by piece. Then I unwound my scarf, unbuttoned my coat, and passed into the warm embrace of the library proper. But the puzzle stayed with me. The next evening, Tuesday, I found myself arriving at the library earlier than usual, and I realized with some amusement that I was curious to see if anyone had added to that small corner of border pieces. The December evening had settled in cold and clear, the kind of night where your breath forms clouds and the stars seem closer than usual, sharp and bright against the darkening sky. I pushed through the heavy library doors, feeling the familiar wash of warm air, hearing the familiar soft sounds of pages turning and keyboards clicking in the distance. The puzzle table stood exactly where it had been. I approached it slowly, removing my gloves and tucking them into my coat pockets. Someone had indeed made progress. The border section had grown, spreading now along two sides of the puzzle. Perhaps 50 or 60 pieces had been added, creating the beginnings of a frame. I could see part of the snowy foreground and a section of the deep blue winter sky. As I stood there, studying the progress, I heard footsteps behind me, quick and purposeful. I glanced over my shoulder to see a young woman, college-aged, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and textbooks pressed against her chest. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of long nights and too much coffee. She wore the universal uniform of the stressed student, sweatpants, an oversized university sweatshirt, and a slightly desperate expression. She stopped when she saw the puzzle, her hurried trajectory interrupted. For a moment she simply stood there, her books still clutched tight, her backpack sliding down her arm. Then, as if reaching a decision, she let out a long breath, lowered her books to a nearby chair, and approached the table. 5,000 pieces, she murmured, reading the box. That is absolutely insane. I smiled but said nothing, not wanting to intrude on whatever private moment she was having with the puzzle. She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, her eyes moving over the scattered pieces, and then her hand reached out almost involuntarily. She picked up a piece, examined it, set it down, picked up another. Her fingers moved with a kind of methodical precision, and I realized she was hunting for edge pieces, those straight-sided fragments that form the framework of any puzzle. I have an exam in an hour, she said, speaking to no one in particular, or perhaps to the puzzle itself. I should go study. I should definitely go study. But her hands kept moving, kept searching, and I watched as she found an edge piece with a bit of snowy white on it. She held it up to the light, squinting at it, then turned to the partially completed border. Her fingers moved along the existing pieces, testing, searching for where this new piece might fit. She tried one spot, then another, then a third, and then, with a soft click that I could hear even from where I stood, the piece slid home. The young woman's entire face changed. The stress lines smoothed, her shoulders dropped half an inch, and a small, genuine smile crossed her features. It was such a tiny victory, one small piece finding its place among thousands, but it mattered. You could see that it mattered. She found 2 more edge pieces in quick succession, placing them both with that same satisfying whisper click, and then she checked her phone, let out a small gasp, and grabbed her books. I will be back, she told the puzzle, and there was something like a promise in her voice. Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing quickly toward the study rooms, leaving behind 3 new pieces in the growing border and a faint impression of her presence in the warm air of the vestibule. I stood there for a few minutes longer, looking at those 3 new pieces. They were such small additions to the whole, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of 5,000 pieces, and yet they were not nothing. They were progress. They were contribution. They were, in their own quiet way, a form of connection between that stressed student and every other person who would stop at this table in the days to come. Finally, I too moved past the puzzle and into the library proper, but some part of my attention remained behind, anchored to that card table and its magnificent, impossible project. Wednesday afternoon brought a different kind of visitor to the puzzle. I had come to return some books and found myself, almost without conscious decision, drifting toward the vestibule to check on the progress. The border had grown substantially overnight. Someone, perhaps several someones, had added dozens of pieces. The frame now stretched perhaps a quarter of the way around the entire puzzle, a growing skeleton that defined the boundaries of the Victorian village waiting to be revealed. As I stood there admiring the work, I heard the soft squeak of wheels on the library's polished floor. A young mother appeared, pushing a stroller that held a sleeping infant bundled in layers of fleece and flannel. The baby could not have been more than a few months old, tiny and peaceful, one small hand curled against a round cheek. The mother looked exhausted in that particular way that new parents have, a bone-deep weariness that goes beyond simple lack of sleep. She had dark roots showing in her blonde hair, and her clothes hung loose in a way that suggested a body still adjusting to postpartum changes. But when she saw the puzzle, something brightened in her face, a small spark of interest in eyes that had probably spent too many hours staring at walls in the middle of the night. She parked the stroller carefully beside the table, engaging the brake with practiced efficiency, and glanced down at her sleeping child. The baby did not stir. Very gently, moving with the exaggerated carefulness of someone terrified of waking a sleeping infant, the woman approached the puzzle. But she did not pick up pieces to place them. Instead, she began to sort. Her movements were almost meditative in their focus. She picked up one piece, examined it, and placed it in a small, clear area of the table. Then another. Then another. I watched, fascinated, as small piles began to form. She was organizing by color, I realized, creating little collections of similar pieces. All the white and cream pieces that might be snow went into one pile. The various shades of brown and tan that could be building walls went into another. The blues that would form the sky gathered in a third grouping. She worked in complete silence, her eyes moving from piece to piece, her hands gentle and sure. Every few moments she would glance at the stroller, checking on the baby, but the infant slept on, undisturbed. The minutes ticked by, 5 becoming 10, becoming 15, and still the young mother sorted, creating order from the chaos of scattered pieces. She never placed a single piece into the growing puzzle. She simply sorted, organizing the pieces into helpful categories, making it easier for whoever came next to find what they needed. It was a different kind of contribution, not the satisfaction of seeing pieces click together, but the quieter pleasure of bringing structure to confusion. When the baby began to stir, making small sounds of impending wakefulness, the woman straightened immediately. She glanced once more at her organized piles, a small smile touching her lips, and then carefully released the stroller brake and wheeled her child away, back into the main library or perhaps out into the cold afternoon. I approached the table after she left and looked at what she had accomplished. The piles she had created were neat and thoughtful, each grouping clearly defined. She had even arranged some of the edge pieces into a separate cluster, making it easier for the next border builder to find what they needed. It was such a generous gift, this organizational work, done with no expectation of recognition, no signature or claim of ownership. Just a tired mother stealing a few moments of peace, contributing what she could in the way that felt right to her, before returning to the demands of new parenthood. The puzzle had become something more than a picture to be assembled. It had become a kind of conversation, a way for people to speak to each other without words. It was late afternoon on Wednesday when I met the man I came to think of as the edge piece zealot. I had developed something of a routine by then, stopping by the library each day on my way home from work, stealing a few minutes in the vestibule to observe the puzzle's progress, before settling into the reading room with whatever book had captured my attention that week. The border was perhaps half complete now, the frame slowly taking shape, and I could see that multiple people had contributed to its construction. But on that Wednesday evening, as I approached the puzzle table, I found someone already there. He was an elderly gentleman, perhaps in his late 70s or early 80s, dressed in a manner that suggested careful thought given to appearance. His cardigan was pressed, his collared shirt buttoned to the throat, and his silver hair was neatly combed. He wore glasses that sat far down on his nose, the kind that require you to tip your head back slightly to see through them properly. He stood at the table with perfect posture, his hands moving slowly, but with absolute certainty. He was hunting for edge pieces. Not just any edge pieces, I realized as I watched, but very specifically the edge pieces. He would pick up a piece, glance at it for the briefest moment, and either set it down in a precise location on the table or return it to the general scatter. He never looked at the interior pieces, never even seemed to consider them. His entire focus, his entire purpose in that moment, was the completion of the border. I stood at a respectful distance, not wanting to intrude, and watched him work. There was something almost ritualistic about his movements, a sense of practiced routine. He had clearly done many puzzles in his life, had developed his own methodology and philosophy. Start with the edges, build the frame, create the structure that everything else will fill. It was a sound approach, tried and true, and he executed it with the precision of someone who had elevated puzzle solving to an art form. Every few minutes, he would find a piece that fit, and his long fingers would guide it into place with a gentleness that was almost touching. Each time a piece clicked home, I could see his shoulders settle slightly, a small release of tension, a moment of quiet satisfaction. He did not smile exactly, but there was a softness to his expression, a kind of peace that seemed to settle over him with each successful placement. He worked for perhaps 20 minutes, never once acknowledging my presence, though I was certain he knew I was there. When he finally stepped back from the table, he removed his glasses, cleaned them carefully on a handkerchief he pulled from his pocket, and replaced them on his nose. Then he studied the border, his head tilting slightly as he examined his work. He had added perhaps a dozen pieces, all of them edges, all of them placed with exacting care. The frame was noticeably more complete, the boundaries of the puzzle more clearly defined. Then, with a small nod of satisfaction, he buttoned the top button of his cardigan, adjusted the collar of his shirt, and walked away, his footsteps slow and measured, disappearing into the main reading room. I learned over the next several days that he came every afternoon at 2 o'clock. I never heard him speak, never learned his name, but he became a fixture at the puzzle table, a reliable presence in the ongoing project. And he never, not once, placed a piece that was not an edge piece. He had his role, his contribution to make, and he made it with dedication and grace. On Thursday evening, the puzzle drew 2 visitors at once, and I found myself witnessing something unexpectedly tender. I had arrived at the library just as the early darkness was settling in. That particular winter twilight that turns the sky to shades of violet and deep blue. The library lights glowed warm and welcoming against the evening chill. And as I pushed through the doors, I could feel the temperature change like a physical embrace. 2 people stood at the puzzle table, close together but not quite touching, their body language speaking volumes about the nature of their acquaintance. They were young, perhaps in their mid-20s, and there was an electricity in the space between them. That particular tension that exists in the early stages of romantic attraction. The young woman wore a green coat and had her dark hair tucked behind one ear in a way that seemed unconscious but charming. The young man kept glancing at her sideways, quick looks that he thought she did not notice, though I could see the small smile on her face that suggested she was very aware of his attention. They were not quite sure what to do with the puzzle, I realized. They had stopped because it was there, because it was something to comment on, something that made the slightly awkward silence of a new relationship feel less fraught. But now that they were standing at the table, they seemed uncertain how to proceed. "I am terrible at puzzles," the young woman said, laughing a little. "I never have the patience for them." "Me neither," the man agreed quickly, and then, as if realizing he should say something different, added, "But maybe we could try, just for a few minutes?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. "Okay," she said softly, "just for a few minutes." They leaned over the table together, their shoulders nearly touching, and began to examine the pieces. The border was substantially complete now, forming a clear frame around the edges, and some internal sections had begun to take shape as well. Someone had started assembling one of the church buildings, and a small cluster of interconnected pieces showed a lamppost with snow gathered at its base. "Look," the young woman said, picking up a piece. "This looks like it might be part of the church." The young man leaned in closer, his face near hers as they both examined the piece. "Where do you think it goes?" They searched together, their heads bent over the partially completed section, and I watched as their hands occasionally brushed, small moments of contact that made them both smile. It took them several minutes to find where the piece fit, trying various positions, rotating it this way and that. But when it finally clicked into place, they both laughed with genuine delight. "We did it," the woman said, turning to face him, and the joy on her face was beautiful to see. "We make a good team," he replied, and there was meaning in his words beyond the puzzle, a tentative offering of something more. They worked together for perhaps 15 more minutes, finding pieces that belonged to the church steeple, gradually building it higher and more complete. Their conversation grew easier, more natural, the awkwardness fading as they focused on this shared task. They laughed when they tried to force pieces that did not fit. They celebrated each successful placement. They created something together, however small. And in doing so, they built something between themselves as well. When they finally left, the young man held the door open for the young woman, and she ducked her head shyly as she passed through. He looked back once at the puzzle table, and I saw him smile, a private expression that seemed to hold both memory and hope. The church steeple stood a little taller now, reaching toward the pale blue winter sky that was slowly taking form above it. Friday evening brought the visitor I found most fascinating, the one I came to think of as the Wanderer. The puzzle was more than half complete now. The border had been finished 2 days earlier, sometime between my Thursday evening visit and Friday morning, and the interior sections had begun to fill in with remarkable speed. The church was nearly done, and someone had completed most of one row of Victorian houses, their colorful painted facades bright against the snow. The cobblestone street that wound through the village had taken shape, and the beginnings of the frosted trees were visible in what would become a small park. I had come later than usual, arriving at the library around 8 in the evening, drawn by some impulse I could not quite name. The building was quieter at this hour, the after-work crowd having departed, leaving behind only the true library devotees, the students working on late assignments, the readers who had nowhere else they needed to be. A teenager stood at the puzzle table, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, wearing headphones around their neck and carrying a skateboard under one arm. They had hair that fell into their eyes and the kind of slouched posture that suggested either boredom or a deliberate attempt to appear unbothered by the world. But their eyes were fixed on the puzzle with an intensity that contradicted their casual stance. They did not touch the pieces at first. They simply stared at them, their gaze moving over the scattered fragments, across the partially completed picture, as if trying to absorb the entire tableau at once. Minutes passed. The teenager remained still, just looking, and I began to wonder if they were actually engaged with the puzzle at all, or simply lost in their own thoughts. Then, without warning, without any visible deliberation, their hand shot out and plucked a single piece from the chaos. They held it up briefly, glanced at the puzzle, and placed it with absolute certainty into a gap I had not even noticed existed in the row of houses. The piece clicked into place perfectly, fitting with a precision that seemed almost miraculous. The teenager stepped back, still not quite smiling, but with a small quirk to their lips that suggested satisfaction. Then they stared at the puzzle again, that same intense, unfocused gaze, and after another long moment, their hand darted out once more, selecting another piece and placing it with the same uncanny accuracy. It was like watching someone in a trance, or perhaps in a state of deep flow where conscious thought gave way to pure intuition. The teenager placed 5 pieces in this manner, each selection seemingly random, each placement absolutely correct, and then they picked up their skateboard, adjusted their headphones onto their ears, and walked away without a backward glance. I approached the puzzle after they left and examined the pieces they had added. They had completed a difficult transition area where the cobblestone street met the snow, a section where the colors were subtle, and similar where most puzzlers would have struggled to find the right pieces. But the teenager had moved through it like water finding its path downhill, effortless and sure. It was a reminder, I thought, that there are as many ways to approach a puzzle as there are people who attempt it. Some methodically sort and organize. Some build the structure first. Some stare into the chaos and let their instincts guide their hands. And all of these approaches are valid. All of them contribute to the completed whole. Saturday morning brought what I came to think of as the Great Sky Crisis. I had arrived at the library around 10 in the morning, earlier than my usual visits, pulled there by an impulse that felt almost protective. The puzzle was nearly complete now, perhaps 75 or 80% finished, and the Victorian village had taken on real dimension and life. The houses stood in their colorful rows. The church steeple pointed toward the heavens. The lampposts glowed with painted light. The trees spread their bare, frost-covered branches against the winter air, but the sky remained largely undone. As I approached the puzzle table, I found several people already gathered there, more than I had ever seen at once. There was a middle-aged woman in a business suit, probably on her lunch break or squeezing in a library visit before some appointment. A young father with a child on his shoulders. An elderly woman with a cane, the edge-piece zealot, of course, who appeared every day at 2, but who had apparently felt compelled to arrive earlier on this particular morning. They all stood staring at the top portion of the puzzle, at the vast expanse of winter sky that awaited completion. And on every face I saw the same expression, a mixture of determination and dawning dismay. The puzzle box lid showed a beautiful, subtle winter sky, pale blue fading to cream, with delicate variations in tone and shade. It looked lovely in the picture. In reality, broken into hundreds of tiny pieces, it was a nearly impossible challenge. Every piece was almost exactly the same color. Every piece had the same faint texture. Without clear delineation of clouds or dramatic shifts in hue, the sky pieces blended together into an overwhelming sea of nearly identical blue-cream fragments. "Good grief," the businesswoman muttered, picking up a sky piece and holding it next to another. "These are absolutely identical." "Maybe sort them by shape?" the young father suggested, his child pulling gently on his hair for attention. The edge-piece zealot, who had after all completed the border of the sky along with everything else, simply shook his head slowly, a gesture that suggested both sympathy and a kind of vindication. He had done his part. The interior was someone else's problem. For several minutes they all stood there in a kind of collective paralysis, each person picking up sky pieces, comparing them, setting them down again with visible frustration. It would have been almost comical if it were not also somehow deeply moving. Here were 5 strangers, people who likely did not know each other's names, would probably never see each other again outside this library vestibule, united in a shared moment of puzzle-related despair. Finally, the elderly woman with the cane laughed, a warm, rich sound that broke the tension. "Well," she said, "I suppose we simply have to accept that this is going to take patience." And something shifted in that moment. The young father set his child down carefully and pulled a chair close to the table. The businesswoman glanced at her watch, seemed to make a decision, and rolled up her sleeves. The edge piece. Zealot, in a moment that seemed almost revolutionary given his usual singular focus, picked up a piece that was definitely not an edge piece and held it up to the light, examining it closely. They began to work together, not in any coordinated way, not with any particular plan, but simply as a collective force directed at the common problem of this impossible sky. Someone, I never knew who, started sorting the sky pieces by shade into the most subtle gradations imaginable. Someone else began to focus on piece shape, creating piles of similar configurations. The young father narrated his process to his child in a soft voice, turning the puzzle work into an impromptu lesson on patience and problem solving. I watched them for a long time. These strangers working side by side in comfortable silence, broken only by occasional murmured comments or small sounds of triumph when someone managed to place a piece. The sky section grew slowly, achingly slowly, but it grew. Each tiny addition felt like a significant victory. When I finally left that morning, they were still there, still working, still united in their determination to complete this challenging section. And I realized that this moment, this collective struggle against the tyranny of the monochromatic sky, was perhaps the truest expression of what the puzzle had become. It was not just about completing a picture, it was about people coming together, even briefly, even in the most modest of ways, to work towards something larger than themselves. By Sunday afternoon, the puzzle was nearly finished. I had come to think of the library vestibule as a kind of sacred space by then, this threshold area where something beautiful was slowly being created through the accumulated efforts of dozens of unseen contributors. Each day had brought new progress, new additions, new evidence of the quiet work being done by people I would never meet, whose names I would never learn, but whose care and attention were evident in every placed piece. The Victorian village was almost complete now. The houses stood in their full glory, each painted facade detailed and bright. The church reached toward the completed sky, its steeple perfect and proud. The trees spread their intricate branches. The lampposts glowed. The cobblestone street wound through the village, connecting all the elements into a cohesive whole. Even the difficult sky had been conquered, that pale winter blue stretching across the top of the puzzle in subtle, hard-won glory. Only a few pieces remained, scattered gaps in the otherwise complete picture. And as I stood there that Sunday afternoon, people drifted in and out, each adding a piece or two before moving on. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a collective awareness that something was nearing its conclusion. An older gentleman placed a piece in the lower right corner. A teenage girl added one to the trees. A man in a delivery uniform, still wearing his work vest, stopped on his way through the vestibule and carefully fitted a piece into the street. And then a child arrived, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, holding her mother's hand and bouncing with excitement. She had clearly been here before, had clearly been tracking the puzzle's progress because she ran to the table and immediately began searching through the remaining pieces with focused intensity. "This one," she announced triumphantly, holding up a piece. "This one goes right here." She was right. The piece fit into a gap in the park section, completing a small area of snow beside one of the benches. Her mother smiled and suggested they look for another, and together they found 2 more pieces. Placing them carefully, the child's small hands guided by her mother's steadier ones. When they left, only 3 pieces remained. 3 small fragments of the 5,000-piece puzzle. 3 final contributions waiting to be made. I stood there looking at those last few pieces and made a decision. I would not be the one to place the final piece. That honor should belong to someone else, to one of the many people who had stopped here over the past week, who had given their time and attention and care to this project. I would leave those last pieces for others to find, for others to complete. I took out my phone and snapped a picture of the nearly finished puzzle, wanting to remember this moment, this creation that had emerged from the collective effort of strangers. Then I went into the library proper, to the reading room where I had spent so many quiet hours, and I settled into my favorite chair with a book. But some part of my mind remained in the vestibule, with the puzzle and its patient, persistent accumulation of pieces. Some part of me was still standing at that card table, watching the village take shape, witness to this small miracle of community. An hour later, as I was preparing to leave for the evening, I passed through the vestibule one last time. The puzzle was complete. All 5,000 pieces had found their places. The Victorian village stood in its full winter glory, every rooftop perfect, every window glowing, every cobblestone rendered in miniature detail. The sky stretched pale and beautiful above it all. The snow lay soft and white in the streets and gathered on the branches of the trees. The whole picture had come together into something more beautiful than the sum of its parts. Someone had placed a new note beside the puzzle box lid. The same careful handwriting from the original "Care to Help" sign had written, "Thank you to everyone who contributed. This was a community effort." I stood there for a long time, taking in the completed picture, and I thought about all the people who had stopped here over the past week. The stressed student with her exam looming, the young mother with her sleeping baby, the edge piece zealot with his systematic approach, the couple on what might have been one of their first dates, the intuitive teenager who seemed to find pieces by instinct rather than logic, the group who had tackled the impossible sky together, the child placing the penultimate pieces with her mother's guidance. None of them had completed the puzzle alone. Perhaps none of them had expected to, or even wanted to. But together, through their accumulated small efforts, through each person giving what they could in the moment they had available, they had created something beautiful. It struck me, standing there in the warm vestibule with the cold December darkness pressing against the windows, that this was the truest kind of community. Not the loud gatherings or the official events, not the organized activities where attendance was tracked and names were recorded, but this, quiet people, strangers to each other, contributing their small pieces to a larger whole, building something together without needing recognition or thanks, without needing to know who else was helping or whether their individual contribution was significant. We are all pieces of a puzzle, I thought, each of us unique, each of us necessary, each of us fitting into places that only we can fill. And when we come together, when we each offer what we have and place our small pieces carefully and well, we create pictures more beautiful than any of us could make alone. The Victorian village glowed under the vestibule lights, complete at last, a testament to patience and collaboration and the quiet power of small acts undertaken with care. I stood there for a few more minutes, memorizing the scene, feeling something settle in my chest that felt very much like gratitude. Then I buttoned my coat, wound my scarf around my neck, and stepped out into the December night. Behind me in the warm light of the library vestibule, the completed puzzle waited a small miracle of community, a beautiful picture built piece by the hands of strangers who had never met, but who had in their own quiet way worked together toward something larger than themselves. And in that moment, walking home through the cold evening air with stars bright overhead, I understood something fundamental about how we are meant to live in this world. We are not meant to do everything alone, to be complete unto ourselves. We are meant to be pieces, imperfect and incomplete on our own, but necessary and valuable as parts of the larger picture. We are meant to contribute what we can, to place our pieces carefully, to trust that others will add theirs, and to know that together, slowly and patiently, we can create something beautiful. The puzzle would likely be taken apart soon, I thought. The pieces would be returned to their box, the table would be cleared, and the vestibule would return to its usual function as a simple transitional space. But the experience of creating it together, of being part of this quiet collaboration, would remain. It would remain in the memory of every person who had placed a piece, every person who had paused to watch the progress, every person who had felt, even briefly, that they were part of something larger than themselves. This is how community is built, not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in small acts of care, in pieces placed thoughtfully, in the quiet decision to contribute what you can when you can, knowing that others will do the same. In libraries and vestibules, in moments stolen between obligations, in the patient work of hands we will never shake, building pictures we will all share. The winter wind picked up as I walked, carrying with it the promise of snow, and I pulled my scarf tighter, thinking of painted snowdrifts on Victorian rooftops, thinking of thousands of pieces coming together, thinking of the warmth that exists not just in heated buildings, but in the spaces between people when they work together towards something good. The next morning, Monday, I arrived at the library earlier than usual, curious to see if the puzzle was still there or if it had been cleared away overnight. The December morning was bright and brutally cold, the kind of day where the air itself seems to crystallize, and my breath formed clouds that dissipated slowly in the stillness. The library doors opened with their familiar heavy swing, and I stepped into the vestibule, stamping my feet gently to shake off the cold. The puzzle was still there. The table had not been moved, but something had changed. The completed Victorian village remained on display, but now someone had carefully placed a large piece of clear glass or acrylic over it, protecting the surface while still allowing it to be seen. Next to it, someone had positioned a small picture frame containing a photograph. I leaned closer to examine it. It was a photo of the puzzle in progress, taken perhaps midweek when it was approximately half complete. But what made my breath catch was what someone had done to the photograph. They had taken a marker and drawn tiny circles around the puzzle table, with small arrows pointing outward, and next to each arrow they had written the date and approximate time. Monday 6 p.m., edge pieces. Tuesday 2 p.m., border work. Wednesday 3 p.m., color sorting. Thursday 5 p.m., church steeple. It was a timeline, a record of progress, but more than that, it was an acknowledgement. Someone had been documenting the work, watching the community effort unfold, bearing witness to all these small contributions, and now they had created a small memorial to the process itself. Below the photograph, another note in that same careful handwriting. Community Art Project. Thank you to every anonymous contributor. Your pieces mattered. I stood there feeling something rise in my throat, some emotion that existed in the space between joy and melancholy, gratitude and longing. The acknowledgement mattered. The recognition that each piece, each moment, each person had been part of something larger. It transformed the completed puzzle from a simple finished product into a documented act of collective creation. A young woman entered the vestibule behind me, and I recognized her immediately. It was the stressed student from that first Tuesday evening, the one who had stopped to place 3 edge pieces before rushing to her exam. She no longer looked quite so frantic, though she still carried textbooks and wore the same oversized university sweatshirt. She stopped when she saw the completed puzzle, her hand going to her mouth in a small gesture of surprise and pleasure. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, we finished it." We. I noticed the word, noticed how naturally she claimed ownership of this collective project, how easily she placed herself as part of the effort. She approached the table slowly, reverently, studying the completed picture. "I only placed 3 pieces," she said, speaking more to herself than to me. 3 tiny pieces, but look, they are there. They are part of it. She stood there for a long moment, and I could see her eyes traveling over the puzzle, perhaps trying to identify exactly where her 3 edge pieces had gone, though by now they were indistinguishable from all the others absorbed into the completed whole. "I was so stressed that night," she said softly. "I had this exam, and I was convinced I was going to fail, and I almost did not stop. But there was something about the puzzle, something about just doing this small, simple thing, finding a piece, placing it, making this tiny bit of progress." She turned to look at me, as if suddenly remembering I was there. "Does that sound silly?" "No," I said, and meant it. "It does not sound silly at all." She smiled, nodded, and then continued on her way into the library proper. But her pace was slower now, her shoulders a little less hunched, as if seeing the completed puzzle had given her some small gift of peace. Over the next hour, as I sat in the reading room trying to focus on my book, I found myself getting up periodically to check the vestibule. Each time I did, I found someone standing at the puzzle table, studying the completed picture. Some stood for only a moment. Others stayed longer, their eyes traveling over every detail. An older gentleman who could only have been the edge piece zealot arrived at exactly 2 o'clock, right on schedule. He approached the puzzle, adjusted his glasses on his nose, and examined the completed border with an expression I could only describe as satisfied approval. He nodded once, a small gesture of benediction, and then continued into the library, his daily ritual complete. A young mother with a stroller paused at the table, and though the baby was awake this time, fussing slightly, she took a moment to look at the puzzle, and I saw her face soften with recognition. She pointed to the neat piles of sorted pieces visible in the photograph, perhaps remembering her own contribution, her own stolen moments of organization and order. A teenager with a skateboard stopped, pulled out their phone, and took a picture of the completed puzzle. They studied it for a moment, their expression unreadable behind the fall of hair over their eyes, and then they nodded, as if confirming something to themselves, before moving on. And I realized that the puzzle was still bringing people together, even in its completed state. It was still creating these small moments of pause, these brief respites from the busy world, these quiet instances of reflection and connection. That evening, before I left the library, I wrote my own small note and added it to the display. I kept it simple. To everyone who stopped to add a piece, thank you for reminding me how beautiful collective effort can be. I signed it simply, a grateful observer. And then I went home, carrying with me the memory of the puzzle and all it had taught me about community, contribution, and the quiet power of small acts undertaken with care. The puzzle remained on display for 2 more weeks, protected under its clear cover, bearing silent witness to the power of collaborative creation. I stopped to look at it every day, and each time I did, I felt something settle in my chest, some reminder that I needed, that perhaps we all need. We are not alone in this world. We are pieces of a larger picture, and when we offer what we have, when we place our small contributions carefully and well, we help create something beautiful. Eventually, the puzzle was disassembled and returned to its box. The table was cleared. The vestibule returned to its usual state, a simple transitional space between the cold outside and the warm library interior. But something remained, some invisible residue of community and care, some sense that this threshold place had been briefly transformed into something sacred by the accumulated efforts of strangers who had never met but who had worked together nonetheless. And sometimes on cold December evenings, when I pass through the library doors and pause in the vestibule to unwind my scarf and unbutton my coat, I remember the Victorian village taking shape piece by piece. I remember the edge piece zealot and the color sorter, the wanderer and the young couple, the stressed student and the tired mother, and all the others whose hands contributed to that beautiful, impossible picture. I remember that we are all pieces of a puzzle, each of us unique and necessary. I remember that community is not always built in loud gatherings, but in quiet moments of shared purpose. And I remember that when we each contribute what we can, trusting that others will do the same, we create pictures more beautiful than any of us could make alone. This is the lesson of the community puzzle, and it is a lesson I carry with me still. We are pieces finding our places in a larger whole. We are hands reaching out to add small contributions to grand projects. We are strangers working together toward something beautiful, building our shared picture piece by patient piece, creating community in the quiet spaces between obligation and rest, between the cold outside world and the warm interior places where we gather. And in that truth, there is something deeply, profoundly comforting. Something that settles the restless mind and eases the worried heart. Something that reminds us, on the darkest and coldest nights, that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that our small efforts matter, that together we are creating pictures of remarkable beauty. Piece by piece, person by person, moment by quiet moment. This is how community is built, This is how beauty is created. This is how we find our way home to each other, even in the cold heart of winter, even in the rushing pace of our busy lives, even in the anonymous spaces where strangers pass without speaking but work together nonetheless. And if this story has resonated with you, if it has offered you some small piece of peace, or reminded you of your own place in the larger picture we are all creating together, please consider showing your support with a like and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. May you rest well, knowing that you too are a necessary piece of the beautiful picture we are building together, one small contribution at a time.